In the Second World War, several major states confront each other on the European continent, and by 1944 the overall situation is no longer in Germany's favour. The United States of America, Great Britain and the Soviet Union are conducting combat operations in different directions but with one goal: to achieve unconditional surrender and dismantle the political system built by the National Socialist German Workers' Party. In the East, after the operations of 1943 and 1944, the Soviet army pushes German troops beyond the Dnieper and back to the borders of pre-war Poland. In the West, the Allies are preparing a landing in northern France under the codename Operation Overlord. In Berlin, they are still drawing up plans and tracing arrows on maps, but the reports already show that the initiative is passing to the opponents of the Third Reich. At the centre of this system stands Adolf Hitler, around whom the figures that define policy, repression, and propaganda are concentrated. The head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, is responsible for the police and the camp network. The Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, controls radio, the press and cinema, and the Commander-in-Chief of the Air Force, Hermann Göring, leads the Air Force and is connected with economic structures. They take part in decisions about the attack on Poland in 1939, on the Soviet Union in 1941, about deportations and forced labour, and in the evening they return to homes where their children are growing up. In these apartments and country residences there are toys and school notebooks, and on the coat racks hangs the uniform with collar patches and rank insignia. By 1944 the leading figures of the Third Reich are already raising children, and in each family this looks different. In the Goebbels household the presence of many children is impossible to miss. Their voices fill the rooms that only a few hours earlier hosted discussions about speeches and radio broadcasts. In Heinrich Himmler's home, his daughter Gudrun grows up surrounded by the same shelves, where her father stores documents bearing his signature as head of the SS. Hermann Göring's daughter Edda lives in an entirely different environment, one shaped by the luxury of Karin Hall, where official receptions, uniformed guards and visiting delegations appear as routinely as toys in a nursery. Martin Bormann's children spend much of the year in boarding schools tied to party structures, moving between strict daily schedules and rare, short visits with a father who is constantly travelling. Although these children almost never appear in official papers, photographs from holidays, ceremonies and family trips show them standing close to men who authorize deportations, forced labour and military operations. For the children themselves, this becomes the normal background of early life. Guards at the entrance, official cars waiting by the steps, and adult conversations about fronts and offensives that sound like distant geography, rather than events shaping the fate of Europe. And before we continue, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel, and if you're enjoying this one, don't forget to subscribe and smash a like. By the summer of 1944, operations in the West and in the East are pushing the situation toward the Third Reich, losing the territories it had seized one after another. In June, Operation Overlord begins. Troops of the United States of America, Great Britain and their allies land in Normandy and advance into the interior of France, taking ports and transport hubs. In the east, the Soviet army launches an offensive against Army Group Center, and German units fall back toward the Vistula, losing cities and railway supply lines. In the homes of top leaders, this is visible in the fact that the fathers appear less and less often, and instead of stories about parades, there are short reports about lost sectors of the front. By early 1945, it becomes clear that Germany will not be able to hold the front in any direction, and the forces of its opponents cross its pre-war borders. The Soviet army is preparing an operation to capture Berlin, involving large formations of infantry, artillery and armour, and in the west Allied forces reach the Rhine and build crossings. In the corridors of buildings in central Berlin, they are no longer discussing new offensives, but how to distribute evacuation planes, trains and official cars among ministries and families. Children are told that they need to be ready to move and to keep a packed suitcase. But it is not explained to them that these are the last weeks of the state in its previous form. In Berlin, a system of underground shelters is created for the top leadership, and the best known of these is the bunker complex under the Reich Chancellery. There are rooms where Adolf Hitler lives and works, and nearby are the premises where Josef and Magda Goebbels are accommodated with their children and closest staff. When Soviet artillery begins to fire on the central districts, part of the personnel and families go down to these levels, and the streets above them are covered with craters and debris. For the children, the world shrinks to narrow corridors, low rooms and rare trips upstairs, accompanied by the sounds of explosions and the smell of burning. After the first months of chaos and internment, the occupation authorities begin to build a more stable system for working with people connected to the former leadership. The main focus shifts to the preparation of trials. Above all, the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg, where Göring, Ribbentrop, Keitel, Jodl, and other top-level figures take their seats in the dock. Their families remain under observation, but at the same time there is a practical task of where and under what conditions the children will live, children who didn't make decisions but bear the same surnames. In correspondence between military and civilian structures there appear lists of schools, care homes and norms for issuing ration cards for such families. In the zone controlled by the United States of America, there are population screening rules with mandatory questionnaires and forms. These ask about membership in the party, security structures in the armed forces, about positions held and family composition, and the children either fill out simplified forms or simply follow the adults. A card is created for each family member, recording age, place of birth, address and connection to a person who worked in the apparatus of the Third Reich. In this way, even school children become written into documentation that will later be examined by historians and journalists. In the zone controlled by the Soviet Union, the aim is similar to identify those who held command and political posts during the war, but the methods are harsher. Interrogations are conducted in strict form. Some people are sent to prisoner of war camps and special camps for civilians, and children sometimes travel eastward in trains with their mothers or are handed over to relatives in other zones. In such movements, feelings are not taken into account, only security, the obtaining of information and control over possible channels of communication. The fate of a child at that moment directly depends on whose hands their personal file is in and which body is making the decision. As life is restored in the Western Zone, schools begin to operate, admitting children from different families. In classrooms at the desks sit both those whose fathers were ordinary soldiers and those whose fathers took part in governing occupied territories, but at first the curricula say almost nothing about camps and mass killings. Teachers focus on reading, arithmetic and general history, and conversations about specific surnames take place in queues and in kitchens rather than in lessons. Children of the former elite try not to stand out, although sometimes they are recognized by their surname or by rumors among adults. In 1949, on parts of the former occupation zones, the Federal Republic of Germany and the German Democratic Republic are formed, and different trajectories open up for the families of former leaders. In the West, a government is created, ministries are formed. Later the Bundeswehr armed forces appear, and the state gradually joins Western economic and defense structures. In the East, they build a system oriented toward the Soviet Union, emphasizing the anti-fascist character of the new order and relying on a different political elite, and this is reflected in textbooks and official speeches. The children of Nazi leaders either remain in the western part or end up in the east, and on this depend school curricula, access to archives and the tone of conversations about the past. In the western part of Germany in the 1950s, an economic boom begins, linked to external aid and currency reform. mass-produced goods enter everyday life, the road network develops, new residential districts and factories are built, and for many people the subject of war recedes into the background. In this atmosphere, it is easier for the children of the former elite to dissolve among others, especially if they change their surname, move to another city, or choose secular professions far removed from politics. However, during checks for work in the state sector, or when certain clearances are issued, information about their origin can still surface in personal files. In the eastern part of Germany, the state actively shapes the image of the struggle against fascism, and at rallies, in textbooks and on posters, the surnames Hitler, Göring, Himmler are regularly heard as symbols of the enemy of the past. The descendants of people connected with this circle are under tight control, and the possibilities of changing name or place of residence are limited by a strict system of registration and exit supervision. Schools, enterprises and the army are subordinated to a single line, and any attempt to conceal a biography can be uncovered when forms and archives are checked. In such a situation, it is safer not to raise the subject of family history than to discuss the role of a father or grandfather. By the end of the 1950s, journalists and researchers begin to take an interest not only in the Nazi leaders themselves, but also in what happened to their families after 1945 in the Federal Republic of Germany. There appear articles and reports about how the wives and children of those convicted in Nuremberg live, and photographs of ordinary apartments and houses make their way into newspapers. Next to images from courtrooms and camps, they print photographs of people in everyday clothes going to work, preparing food, or sitting at a table in a cramped kitchen, and these images place two realities side by side. For the children of the former elite, this means that their surname once again returns to the public sphere, now not only in personnel lists but also in material about how the past continues to be present in their lives. One of the first examples of how a person lives with such a burden is the daughter of Reichsführer SS, Heinrich Himmler, Gudrun Himmler. She leaves an internment camp as a teenager and arrives in the Federal Republic of Germany, where new ministries and security services are operating and the Bundeswehr is being formed. School textbooks say almost nothing about camps and gas chambers. The main focus is on the structure of the young state and economic reconstruction. At the same time, the surname Himmler in newspapers and research is already linked to the network of concentration camps and mass murder, and every form runs up against the line, Father Heinrich Himmler. Gudrun lives with her mother, finishes school and tries to find a job that will allow her to live without constant questions about her origins. When applying for a position, she fills out standard forms where she has to indicate her year of birth, place of residence and her parents' details, and the name has to be written out in full. In the archives of the security services, there remain documents in which information about the Himmler family stands next to internal notes about her possible contacts. On the everyday level, this looks like an attempt to live like everyone else, but each new form reminds her who her father was in the system of the Third Reich. In the early 1950s, Gudrun gets a job as a secretary in one of the bodies connected with the foreign intelligence apparatus, built on the basis of the Reinhard Gehlen organization. This service collects information about the Soviet Union and the countries of the Eastern Bloc, and cooperates with partners in the United States of America. Inside the office, she performs routine work, typing documents, taking minutes at meetings and handling correspondence. Later, when researchers begin to study personnel lists, the very fact that the daughter of Reichsführer SS is working in an institution serving the new security system of the FRG becomes a subject in its own right. At the same time, Gudrun makes contact with people who are helping former SS members and their families. By the mid-1950s in the Federal Republic of Germany, there are associations that collect money for lawyers, trips to prisoners and support for their relatives. One such association, known as Silent Help, becomes a focal point for former members of the military and police structures of the Third Reich, At these meetings, Gudrun is present not as a random participant but as the daughter of Heinrich Himmler, and her name gives these gatherings particular weight. Within silent help, they discuss specific criminal cases, who has been convicted in the FRG, who is being sought in France or Poland, which episodes are being examined by courts in connection with actions in the camps. They need people willing to conduct correspondence, arrange money transfers and maintain contact with lawyers and prisoners' families, and Gudrun regularly takes part in this work. In letters to those serving sentences for participating in mass killings and deportations, she expresses sympathy and approval, without questioning the general nature of their activities during the war years. As a result, in research at the end of the 20th century, her trajectory is described as an example of long-term loyalty to the milieu in which her father occupied a central place. Alongside this line stands a completely different example linked to Niklas Frank, the son of the Governor-General of occupied Poland, Hans Frank. During the war, his father headed the civil administration of a territory centred on Krakow, and the decisions on repression, deportations and exploitation of the population passed through the apparatus of the general government. After the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg, Hans Frank was executed in 1946, and his name was fixed in the documents as that of one of the main criminals. At first, Niklas learns about this from fragmentary conversations and photographs, and later gains access to the trial materials and the official correspondence. Reading interrogation records, orders and his father's speeches, he constructs for himself a picture in which there is no room for exculpatory formulas. The documents record shootings, deportations, and the destruction of the Jewish population, and the surname Frank appears in all the key bundles of decisions on occupied Poland. Against this background, Niklas consciously refuses to repeat phrases such as knew nothing, or could not influence anything, and chooses direct language. In the 1980s, he publishes a book in which he combines childhood memories of life in the residence on Wawel with stark quotations from the documents of the general government and the Nuremberg materials. After the book appears, Niklas Frank begins speaking in schools and at public events. He shows photographs, reads out excerpts from orders, and explains how his father's decisions affected the inhabitants of Krakow, Warsaw, and other cities. For listeners, it's important that they're hearing not only a journalist, but also the son of a man whose signature stood under orders that led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. Within German society, his figure becomes a noticeable example of how a descendant can choose not to defend the family surname, but to call his father a criminal outright. A third line in this group is linked to the children of the Minister of Armaments, Albert Speer, who headed the system of forced labour and military construction. At Nuremberg, Speer received a long sentence and remained in Spandau prison until 1966, and after his release he became a prominent figure in the public life of the Federal Republic of Germany. He published memoirs, appeared on television programs, and maintained the image of an educated technician who supposedly distanced himself from the most extreme forms of violence. For a long time, this image strongly influenced how his role was perceived in mass consciousness. His daughter, Hilde Schramm, initially relies on this very version, based on her father's letters, recollections and public appearances. Gradually she becomes acquainted with research on the system of forced labour, on the construction of factories and underground installations where prisoners and foreign workers were used. In these works, the Ministry of Armaments and Albert Speer personally are described as key participants in exploitation rather than as outside observers. Against this background, Hilde decides to direct part of her inheritance not to personal needs, but to the support of projects related to memory and the fight against racism. She sells some of the works of art and objects that the family had inherited, and uses the money to set up a foundation that finances scholarships and human rights initiatives. In the press, this decision is recorded as an example of how the descendant of a high-ranking figure of the Third Reich can turn material inheritance in the opposite direction. The figure of Hilde Schramm stands in sharp contrast to the trajectory of Gudrun Himmler, who puts her efforts into supporting former SS members. In the story of the children of Nazi leaders, these several lives show how differently a surname and what stands behind it can be used. In parallel with the high-profile stories of Gudrun Himmler, Niklas Frank and Hilde Schramm, the fate of the son of Party Chancellor Martin Bormann Jr., unfolds. At the end of the war, he finds himself under another name with a foster family in the countryside, and lives for several years as an ordinary child whose past is known only to the adults in the house. His father, one of the closest people to Adolf Hitler, disappears in May 1945 in the Berlin area, and is listed as missing for many years until examinations of remains confirm his death. This interval gives the son time to form his own biography, before the Bormann surname finally returns to official documents. Later, Martin Bormann Jr. returns to his real surname and chooses a path connected with the Catholic Church and teaching. He receives a theological education, becomes a priest, and works in parishes where he deals with people as a pastor rather than as the son of the party chancellor. Over time, he takes part in meetings devoted to dialogue between Christians and Jews, and thus indirectly becomes involved in work with Holocaust memory. In his biography, his father's surname is present but does not turn into a justification or the basis of political activity. An even harsher perspective opens up through the fate of the family of Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz. During the war, the family home is located next to the campgrounds. The children see fences, barracks, and columns of people, but do not receive a full explanation from adults of what is happening. After the capitulation, the mother and children go through interrogations and relocations, and the Höss surname passes from official documents into textbooks, museum exhibitions and memorial texts. Rudolf Höss's grandson, Rainer Höss, encounters this reality in post-war school and in museums rather than at the family table. As an adult, Rainer Höss deliberately turns to the archives connected with the Auschwitz camp and spends a great deal of time on the grounds of the memorial. He studies maps, orders and survivors' testimonies, and sees his grandfather's surname under documents recording the arrival of trains and the organisation of killings. Against this background, he decides to speak openly about his origins and to take part in projects dedicated to the memory of the victims. Rainer speaks in schools, takes part in documentary films, and cooperates with organisations working against anti-Semitism. And in these formats, his surname is used as a tool for a direct conversation about the mechanisms of the system. In a similar way, family history and work with documents intersect in the case of the family of Amon Goeth, commandant of the Plasso concentration camp. His daughter Monika Hertwig grows up with an incomplete and softened version of her father's biography, and later, as she becomes acquainted with archives and films, she learns the scale of the shootings and executions on the campgrounds. As an adult, she takes part in a documentary project in which she visits, together with a woman who survived the camp, the place where the Goeth family home once stood. The camera records their joint walk through a space where the commandant's house and the prisoner's area once stood side by side, and the viewer sees how two biographies collide at a single geographical point. A separate line is formed by the story of Jennifer Teege, granddaughter of Amon Goeth, who grows up in a foster family and for a long time does not know about her origins. As an adult, she happens by chance to take a book from a library in which, on one of the pages, she sees a photograph of her mother and learns who her grandfather was. This discovery leads to a trip to Poland, visits to places connected with the Plasso camp, and to work on her own book, in which she describes in detail the path from ignorance to a confrontation with family history. Through this story, it becomes clear how information about the past can be excluded from family transmission and then suddenly return through a single text and a single photograph. Alongside the well-known names, there are many less visible trajectories in which the sons, daughters and grandchildren of former leaders live outside major public projects, but still feel the influence of their surname. Some change their name and move to other countries, trying to break all associations with the Third Reich. Others remain in Germany and take part in local initiatives connected with memorials, school projects, or city exhibitions. In local newspapers and programs, there are references to descendants who help organize commemorative events or work with archival materials. These stories rarely reach the international level, but add to the picture of how the past affects the private lives of individuals. Over time, from these divergent lives, books, foundations, court cases and documentary films, a special layer of post-war history takes shape. In it, the sons, daughters and grandchildren of Nazi leaders cease to be only an appendix to the biographies of Himmler, Frank, Speer, Bormann or Goethe, and become participants in the discussion of how to live with such a legacy. Some, like Gudrun Himmler, build their lives around supporting former SS members and repeating old patterns of justification. Others, like Niklas Frank, Hilde Schramm, Rainer Höss, Monika Hertwig, Jennifer Tiege, and dozens of less well-known people, stake everything on open discussion and work with documents, and their choices become part of the long post-war continuation of a history that formally ended in 1945 but continues to unfold in private biographies.